George Hutton, a 62-year-old millionaire from Boston, was a man whose life could have been the subject of a classic American novel about achieving the American dream. Born into the family of a simple electrician, George learned from childhood the value of hard work and the importance of family. Outwardly, George looked like a typical, successful businessman of his generation, tall, trim, with shrewd blue eyes and neatly trimmed gray hair. He preferred classic suits that emphasized his status, but in rare moments of relaxation he could afford simple jeans and a shirt, reminding of his humble roots. George's career was impressive. He started with a small electrical equipment company and in 30 years had grown it into a major corporation leading the medical device market. His business acumen, innovative thinking, and ability to take risks at the right moment brought him not only financial success, but also respect in business circles. However, behind the facade of a successful businessman was a complex man with deep emotional wounds. The loss of his wife 5 years ago left a void in his soul that he was never able to fill. Elizabeth was not just his spouse, but also his best friend, counselor, and support. Her departure made George sink even deeper into his work, unwittingly distancing himself from his children. George was an old-school man for whom showing emotion was considered a sign of weakness. He rarely spoke of his feelings, preferring to express his love and care through the material support of the family. This often led to misunderstandings between him and the children, especially after the death of Elizabeth, who always mediated their communication. Despite his outward sternness, George possessed a soft heart and a subtle sense of humor, which he rarely displayed in public. He was a generous philanthropist, anonymously supporting various educational and medical programs. His passion was antique clocks, which he had been collecting for many years. Deep down, George was always afraid of losing touch with the reality he knew as a young man. This partly explained his paranoid thoughts about the children's conspiracy. It wasn't so much the loss of money that he feared, but the loss of control over his life and family. George Hutton sat in his spacious mahogany-paneled office and glumly examined the family photograph on the massive oak desk. It had been taken only 2 years ago on his 60th birthday, but it seemed an eternity ago. In the photograph, he himself, a stately man with a graying temple and a confident smile, stood surrounded by his 3 grown children, Michael, Sarah, and James. All looked happy, bound by invisible threads of family unity. Now George felt that idol slipping through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. He sighed as he leaned back in his leather armchair and looked out the window at the manicured garden of his Boston mansion. It was an unusually clear spring day, but George's mood didn't match the weather. Something had definitely changed in the last few months. Phone conversations with the children had become shorter and more intense. They came to visit less often, and when they did, they seemed distant, as if they were hiding something. George couldn't say exactly when it started, but he could feel the chasm between him and his offspring growing. "Damn it, they're definitely up to something," George muttered, stroking his graying beard absent-mindedly. He looked at the photograph again, gazing into the children's faces, trying to find answers in them. Michael, his oldest son, 37 years old, had always been ambitious. He had followed in his father's footsteps and now held a high position in George's company. But lately he had become more withdrawn, often staying late at the office and avoiding family dinners. Sarah, the middle child, 32 years old, was creative. She owned a small gallery in downtown Boston and was always closest to George. Recently, however, she had begun canceling their traditional Sunday brunches, citing her workload. The youngest, 29-year-old James, recently graduated from law school and took a job at a prestigious firm. He had always been the rebel in the family, but his recent visits home had been especially tense, filled with reticence. George stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the gardener trimming the hedge. Could it be about money? In his 62 years, George had amassed an impressive fortune by building a medical device company from scratch. He's always prided himself on raising his children to be hardworking and independent. But what if the lust for inheritance proved stronger? He shook his head, pushing the gloomy thoughts away. No, there had to be some other explanation. His children couldn't have been so mercantile. He'd raised them better than that. George went back to the desk and opened a drawer, taking out an old photograph. It showed him, very young, standing next to his father outside their old house in a working-class neighborhood in Boston. He remembered how hard his electrician father had worked to give his son an education, how proud he was of him when George started his own company. Suddenly it hit him, an idea so crazy he couldn't hold back a chuckle. "What if," he whispered, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk. A plan began to form in his head. It was risky, perhaps even foolish. But if it worked, he would know the truth. George stood up resolutely, feeling an adrenaline rush he hadn't felt in years. He went to the phone and dialed the number of his old friend, the owner of an electrical repair company. "Hello, Frank? It's George. Listen, I need your help. Remember how you said I could always try my hand at being an electrician? Well, I'm ready to take you up on your offer." Finishing the conversation, George felt his determination overwhelm him. Tomorrow he would no longer be millionaire George Hutton. Tomorrow he would become a simple Joe, the electrician who had a family secret to solve. And maybe in the process, he'll remember what it's like to be closer to his roots and to his children. The next morning finds George Hutton in an unfamiliar environment. Instead of enjoying a cup of expensive coffee in his luxurious kitchen, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror scrutinizing his face. His usually smooth-shaven cheeks were now covered with light stubble, the result of a missed evening shave. "Nice," he muttered to himself. "A real hard worker." George ran his hand over his chin, feeling an unfamiliar tingling sensation. This was only the beginning of his transformation. Leaving the bathroom, he quickly dressed in the simplest clothes he could find in his closet, worn jeans and an old t-shirt he usually wore to work in the garden. Then he went down to the kitchen where his housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, was already preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Hutton," she greeted him, but then froze, looking surprised at his unusual appearance. "Do you have any special plans today?" George smiled, noticing her confusion. "Yes, Mrs. Perkins, I do. I guess you could say I'm taking the day off today. I'm going to take care of some personal business." The housekeeper nodded, though it was obvious that she wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. George quickly swallowed his breakfast and left the house, trying not to attract too much attention. Getting behind the wheel of his unremarkable sedan, not the luxurious Mercedes he usually drove, George headed downtown. His first stop was the Workers' Bee specialty clothing store in Boston's industrial district. As George entered the store, the bell above the door jingled. Inside smelled like new fabric and leather. The shelves and racks were filled with a variety of work clothes and gear. "What can I do for you?" The salesman, a middle-aged man with a tired look, asked. George hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure exactly what he needed. I need some electrician's clothes," he finally squeezed out. The salesman gave him an appraising look. "Newbie, huh? Okay, let's get you everything you need." George spent the next hour picking out the right outfit. He bought a blue jumpsuit, which the salesman assured him was the standard uniform for many electricians. Then came the work boots, sturdy, with a protective toe, slightly worn so as not to look too new. "Now for the tools," the salesman said, leading George to the racks at the back of the store. "You'll need a basic set: screwdrivers, pliers, wire cutters, multimeter." George nodded, trying to memorize the names and purpose of each tool. He chose a set that looked professional enough, but not too expensive. Finished shopping, George paid in cash, trying not to draw attention to his expensive credit card. As he walked out of the store with his large bag in hand, he felt a strange excitement. The first step had been taken. The next stop was a small theater makeup store. George bought a few items that he hoped would help him change his appearance: a false mustache, some makeup to create a tan effect, and a product to temporarily dye his hair a darker color. Back home, George locked himself in his office. He laid out all of his purchases on the table and began to prepare for his transformation. First, he put on a jumpsuit that was a little tight in the shoulders. "I'll have to work on my posture a little," George thought, remembering how his father always slouched a little after a long day at work. Then he started on his face. Following the instructions on the package, George applied makeup, giving his skin a more tanned look, like someone who works hard outdoors. The false mustache was more difficult to use than he expected, but after a few tries he managed to secure it naturally enough. The final touch was to color his hair. George applied the paint, being careful not to stain his clothes, and waited for it to work. When he rinsed it off and looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Instead of a gray-haired businessman, he looked like a dark-haired middle-aged worker. Now it was time for the hardest part: the voice and manner of speech. George turned on a video on his computer with examples of working-class Boston accents and began practicing. "Hi, I'm Joe, here to check the wiring," he repeated over and over, trying to catch the right pronunciation and intonation. He experimented with different variations, dropping and adding letters until he found a sound that seemed authentic enough. Hour after hour George practiced, repeating phrases in front of a mirror, watching his facial expressions and gestures. He tried to make his speech more sloppy, adding slang expressions he'd heard from construction workers. By late afternoon, George's throat was hoarse from the constant repetition of phrases, but he was pleased with the result. His Joe sounded convincing, at least to his own ears. After removing his costume and washing off his makeup, George went to bed feeling strangely excited. Tomorrow he was to put his plan into action. He wouldn't just be playing a part. His acting skills would determine whether he could uncover his children's secret. As George fell asleep, he remembered his father, his calloused hands, his tired smile after a long day at work. "I'm sorry, Dad," he mumbled, half asleep. "I know you wouldn't approve of this masquerade, but I have to know the truth." With these thoughts, George fell into a restless sleep in which he repeated over and over, "Hi, I'm Joe, here to check the wiring." Monday morning was cool and foggy. George Hutton, now Joe, sat behind the wheel of an old van parked around the corner from his children's mansion. He drummed his fingers nervously on the steering wheel, glancing at his watch. It was 7:30 in the morning, the time when most electricians start their workday. George took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror, checking his masquerade. Dark hair, slightly unshaven face, false mustache. Everything was in place. The blue jumpsuit sat on him unaccustomed, rubbing slightly in his armpits. "You can do it, old boy," he muttered under his breath, trying to speak with an accent even in private. "You're a goddamn millionaire. If you could build an empire, you can play electrician too." Gathering his courage, George started the van and slowly pulled up to the gates of the mansion. He pressed the intercom button, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Yes?" A woman's voice came from the speaker. George recognized the voice of the housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. "This is Joe from Electric Express. I'm told you're having trouble with the wiring." A short pause followed. That's odd. I haven't heard anything about that. But hang on a minute, I'll check it out." George waited, tapping his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. Those few minutes seemed an eternity to him. Finally, the gate creaked open. "Drive through, please," Mrs. Thompson said. I'll meet you out front." George drove slowly down the long driveway lined with neatly trimmed bushes. He'd been here often, but now everything seemed different, foreign. He parked the van in front of the house and got out, trying to move the way he imagined a tired worker should. Mrs. Thompson, a full woman in her 50s, was waiting for him on the porch. "Good morning," she said, scrutinizing him. "I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand. Miss Sarah didn't say anything about wiring problems." George felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't expected his daughter to be home at this hour. "Oh, really?" he said, trying to sound surprised but not too concerned. "Maybe it was Mr. Michael or Mr. James who ordered the check. Our office said the call came from this house." Mrs. Thompson frowned. "Well, I'm not so sure. Let me get Miss Sarah. She can clarify the situation." George nodded, feeling his heart begin to pound again. He hadn't planned on running into Sarah so soon. While Mrs. Thompson went to fetch Sarah, he tried to look casual as he surveyed the front of the house and pretended to assess the scope of the job. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity to George, the door opened and Sarah stepped out onto the porch. His heart clenched at the sight of his daughter. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes. She was wearing a business suit. She was probably going to work. "What can I do for you?" Sarah asked, giving him a suspicious look. George took a deep breath, mentally crossed himself, and said a prepared sentence. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Joe from Electric Express. We've been notified of a wiring problem." He tried not to betray his excitement, but he could feel a trickle of sweat running down his forehead. Sarah frowned, and for a moment George thought she recognized him, but then she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but there must be some misunderstanding. We didn't call an electrician," she said, and George caught a note of irritation in her voice. "That's odd," he replied, trying to sound puzzled. "We have it on record in our office that the call came from this house. Maybe one of your brothers placed the order?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I don't think so. Michael's on a business trip right now, and James, well, he would have told me." George felt his plan begin to crumble. He was frantically thinking about what to do next. "Tell you what," he said, trying to sound as convincing as possible. "While I'm here, why don't I check the wiring after all? For free, of course. We're having a promotion right now. Free inspection for new customers. Better safe than sorry, right?" Sarah hesitated. George saw her glance at her watch. Apparently she was late for work. "Well, I don't know," she began. "Miss Sarah," Mrs. Thompson intervened, "maybe we really should let him check. Remember last week when the lights were flashing in the living room?" Sarah sighed. "Okay, all right. But please be quick about it. I have an important meeting in an hour." George felt a wave of relief come over him. "Of course, ma'am. I'll try to manage as quickly as possible." Sarah nodded to Mrs. Thompson. "Show him where the shield room is and keep an eye on him, please. I need to get ready." With those words, she turned and left for the house. George followed Mrs. Thompson, who led him to the service entrance. "The shield room is in the basement," she said as she opened the door. "Do you mind if I mind my own business? I've got a lot of work to do." "Of course, ma'am," George replied. "I'll find my way around. Thanks for your help." As soon as Mrs. Thompson left, George took a deep breath. He was inside. Now the hardest part of his plan was beginning. He actually went down into the basement and found the panel room. George opened it and studied the wires and switches for a while, remembering everything he had managed to read about the electrician's job in the last few days. Then, making sure that no one was watching him, he started cautiously up the stairs, listening for every sound in the house. He knew the layout by heart. He had been involved in the design of the house himself. But now, everything seemed alien and dangerous. George moved cautiously through the hallways, pretending to check outlets and switches. His target was Michael's office on the second floor. If there are any secrets, he thought, they must be there. As he went up to the second floor, George heard Sarah's voice. She was on the phone in her room. He froze, listening. "Yes, James, he's here." "No, I don't know where he came from." "Yes, of course I'll see to it." "No, I don't think he suspects anything." George's heart beat faster. What are they talking about? Who is this he? Had they really figured him out? He was so absorbed in eavesdropping that he didn't notice the approaching footsteps. Suddenly, the door to Sarah's room opened and she stepped out into the hallway, still holding the phone to her ear. Their eyes met. For a moment, George forgot who he was and where he was. He looked at his daughter and he wanted to drop the silly masquerade, put his arms around her and ask her what was going on. But the moment passed. Sarah frowned, looking at him. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. George blinked, coming to his senses. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, trying to speak with an accent. "I'm checking the wiring on the second floor. The basement's fine, but sometimes problems can be higher up." Sarah eyed him suspiciously. "Okay," she said finally, "but please hurry up, I have to go now." George nodded and pretended to check the nearest outlet. Sarah gave him another glance, then quickly made her way down the stairs. Left alone, George exhaled. This was close, too close. But now he had even more questions. What was Sarah talking about? Who was this he they didn't want to alert? Deciding that there wasn't much time left, George quickly headed for Michael's office. The door was locked, but he had a universal key, one of the perks of being a homeowner. Entering the study, he began to look around. Everything looked the same as usual: a neat desk, bookshelves, pictures of the family on the walls. But something was not right. George couldn't say exactly what it was, but he could sense that something was different here. He began to check the desk drawers carefully, being careful not to disturb the order of the papers. In the bottom drawer, he found a folder labeled Project Phoenix. George had never heard of this project. Opening the folder, he saw a series of financial reports and charts. The numbers were huge. Millions of dollars were moving between different accounts. George frowned. It looked like a money laundering scheme, but why would Michael be involved in this? Suddenly he heard footsteps in the hallway. George quickly put the folder back and sprinted out of the office, barely having time to lock the door. "Hey, you!" he heard Mrs. Thompson's voice. "What are you doing here?" George turned to her, trying to look as innocent as possible. "Checking the wiring, ma'am. It's okay. I'm done now." Mrs. Thompson looked at him incredulously. "Miss Sarah has already left. She told you to finish up and leave." George nodded. "Of course, ma'am. I was just about to leave." He went downstairs, gathered his tools, and left the house. Getting into the van, George took a deep breath. His hands shook as he started the car. George sat in the old van parked around the corner from his children's mansion. His hands were still trembling slightly from the sudden banishment from his home. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts and analyze everything that had happened. Suddenly, his attention was caught by a familiar car pulling up to the house. It was the car of James, his youngest son. George tensed as he watched James park and get out of the car. A few minutes later, Sarah came out of the house. The brother and sister met on the porch, and George saw them talking animatedly about something. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to get closer to hear their conversation. Carefully getting out of the van, George, still in his electrician suit, slowly approached the house. He hid behind a large rhododendron bush, close enough to hear the conversation but remaining undetected. "Are you sure Dad won't suspect anything?" Sarah whispered, looking around. James grinned. "Relax. He has no idea about the surprise party," he replied. "Michael has already ordered his favorite cake and invited all his old friends." George froze, feeling his heart fill with warmth and shame at the same time. A surprise party? For him? All his suspicions and fears instantly evaporated, replaced by a feeling of deep embarrassment. "But you know, Dad," Sarah continued. "He's always noticing things, and if he finds out what we're planning, the whole surprise will be ruined." Don't worry, James reassured her. We've thought of everything. Michael told him he was away on a business trip so Dad wouldn't try to contact him. I casually mentioned I'd be busy over the weekend. What about you? I said I had an important gallery show, Sarah replied, but I hate lying to him so much. It's for a good cause, James said. Imagine how excited he'll be when he sees all his friends and co-workers together, especially after he's been so br-oody lately. George felt a lump come up to his throat. He remembered how distracted and aloof he really had been in recent weeks, immersed in his suspicions and fears. And his children had been planning a surprise for him all along. You're right, Sarah sighed. It's just that I'm worried. Dad seems so lonely lately. After Mom left, it's like he's withdrawn. That's why this party is so important, James said softly. We need to show him how much people love and appreciate him. George felt a tear roll down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, afraid someone might see it. His children, his beautiful, caring children, had done all this for him, and he had come here, overdressed, suspecting them of God knows what. What about that strange electrician? Sarah asked suddenly. George tensed. You didn't think it was suspicious? Yes, a strange sort, agreed James. But Mrs. Thompson said he didn't do anything, just inspected the wiring and left. It was probably just a mistake. Probably, Sarah said uncertainly. Okay, let's get back to planning the party. We don't have much time left. George heard them enter the house and quietly crept out of his hiding place. He was overwhelmed with emotions. Shame for his suspicions, love for the children who cared so much for him, and a deep sense of guilt for this whole masquerade. He wandered slowly back to his van, feeling devastated and yet filled with renewed determination. As he got behind the wheel, George sat motionless for a long time, looking at his children's house. He realized that he had to change, had to become again the kind of father his children deserved, a father who trusts them, who is open to communication, who doesn't hide behind masks and suspicions. Starting the engine, George was determined that he would never doubt his children again. He would be honest with them, spend more time with them, take an interest in their lives. And of course, he would pretend he knew nothing about the upcoming surprise party. He would be genuinely surprised and delighted when the time came. Because now he knew it wouldn't just be a party. It would be a new beginning for their family, a chance to rebuild the bonds he had nearly destroyed with his suspicions and alienation. Leaving the neighborhood where his children lived, George smiled, feeling light-hearted for the first time in a long time. He was grateful to fate for this lesson, for the opportunity to see the love of his children. And he vowed to himself that he would never again give that love a reason to doubt himself. George Hutton drove the old wagon through the streets of Boston. The city around him lived its usual life. People hurried about their business, cars honked in traffic. But for George, it was as if the world had stopped. Scraps of the overheard conversation swirled in his head, mingling with his own thoughts and doubts. Parking the van in the garage of his luxurious mansion, George didn't get out of the car right away. He sat staring into the void, trying to make sense of everything that had happened during this crazy day. Finally, taking a deep breath, he forced himself out of the van and headed for the house. Entering his spacious hallway, George felt like a stranger in his own home. The luxurious furnishings he had once been so proud of now seemed cold and meaningless. He slowly made his way up the stairs, heading for his bedroom. Closing the door behind him, George finally allowed himself to relax. He pulled off his work coveralls, feeling relieved that he could pull off this masquerade. Walking over to a large mirror, he began to remove the remnants of his costume. First, George carefully removed the false mustache that had been tickling his upper lip all day. Then he pulled off the wig, exposing his own gray hair. The final touch was washing his face. He carefully washed off the makeup that made his skin look tanned and rougher. Looking at his real reflection in the mirror, George felt overwhelmed with emotion. Before him stood not a successful businessman, not a millionaire, but just a tired older man with sad eyes. "The old fool," he muttered, shaking his head. "They just wanted to give me a surprise for my birthday." Those words, spoken aloud, felt as if they had burst a dam. George felt tears roll down his cheeks. He sank to the edge of the bed, covering his face with his hands. All his suspicions, all his fears were unfounded. His children were not plotting anything bad, not trying to cheat or steal from him. They just wanted to make him feel good, to have a party, to bring his friends and colleagues together. And he'd acted paranoid, like a man who didn't trust his own children. George remembered sneaking around his children's house, going through Michael's papers, eavesdropping on conversations. Shame swept over him. "What has become of me?" George whispered, lifting his gaze to his reflection. In the mirror he saw not only himself, but also the photograph on his bedside table. It was of his entire family, himself, his late wife, and his 3 children, still very young, all smiling, looking happy. George took the photograph in his hands, gently running his finger over the faces of his children. How long ago that was! How much had changed since then! His wife had passed away, his children had grown up, and he had turned into a suspicious old man who couldn't trust even the people closest to him. He remembered how, after his wife's death, he had immersed himself in his work, distanced himself from his children. At first it seemed like a way to cope with grief, but gradually it became a way of life. He saw Michael, Sarah, and James less and less, knew less about their lives. And when he began to notice changes in their behavior, instead of talking to them openly, he began to suspect the worst. "I'm sorry, darling," George whispered, looking at his wife's smiling face in the photograph. "I failed you, failed our children." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sunset over Boston. The city was tinged with gold and pink, reminding him that even after the darkest day comes a new dawn. George realized he had to change. He must become again the kind of father his children deserve. A father who trusts them, who is open to communication, who doesn't hide behind masks of mistrust and suspicion. He remembered Sarah's words he overheard. "Dad seems so lonely lately. After Mom left, it's like he's withdrawn." These words hurt George's heart. He hadn't realized that his children could see his pain, his loneliness. So instead of distancing themselves, they decided to do something to make him happy. Organize a surprise party, get all his friends and co-workers together, to show him that he wasn't alone, that he was loved and appreciated. George felt his heart fill with warmth and gratitude. Despite his estrangement, his children had not abandoned him. They still cared for him, still wanted to see him happy. He realized what he had to do. Of course, he would pretend he knew nothing about the upcoming surprise party. He would be genuinely surprised and delighted when the time came. But that would only be the beginning. George decided that after the party, he would be sure to talk to the kids. He will apologize for his estrangement, tell them how much he loves them and how much he appreciates their concern. He'll be honest with them, admit that he's had a hard time since their mother died, but now he's ready to be a part of their lives again. He will spend more time with them, take an interest in their lives, their problems and joys. He would try to make up for lost time, to be the father he had always wanted to be. George smiled, feeling light at heart for the first time in a long time. He was grateful to fate for this lesson, for the opportunity to see the love of his children, and he vowed to himself that he would never again give that love a reason to doubt himself. Taking another look at the family photo, George felt a surge of determination. He knew that the road to repairing his relationship with his children would not be an easy one. There would be much to discuss, much to forgive, but he was ready for it, ready to be a real father to his children again. "Thank you, my darlings," he whispered, looking at the faces of his children in the picture. Thank you for not leaving your silly old man behind." With those words, George walked resolutely out of the bedroom. He had a lot of work to do. He needed to get rid of the evidence of his masquerade tonight, return the van to his friend, and prepare for his upcoming birthday party. But most importantly, to prepare for a new phase in his life, a stage where there would be no room for suspicion and mistrust, only love and openness. Walking down the stairs, George felt 10 years younger. He knew he had many challenges ahead of him, but now he had a purpose, and that purpose gave his life new meaning. 3 months had passed since the day George Hutton, disguised as an electrician, had broken into his children's home. A warm summer evening was descending on Boston, coloring the sky in delicate shades of pink and orange. The spacious terrace of the Hutton mansion was bustling with activity as the whole family gathered for the traditional Sunday dinner. George sat at the head of the table, watching his children and their families with a smile. Michael, his oldest son, was animatedly discussing the latest company news with James. Sarah, leaning over her clipboard, was showing something to her husband David, probably sketches for a new exhibit in her gallery. The grandchildren, 6-year-old twins Emma and Ethan, Michael's children, and 3-year-old Olivia, Sarah's daughter, played on the lawn under the supervision of a nanny. Looking at this idyllic picture, George couldn't help but remember how only 3 months ago he had been ready to ruin it all because of his unfounded suspicions. He still felt a pang of shame remembering his ridiculous masquerade, but gratitude for the way things had turned out outweighed all the negative emotions. The surprise party his children had thrown for his birthday had been a turning point. George, as he had promised himself, pretended not to know anything, and his surprise and joy were genuine when he saw all his friends and co-workers gathered to celebrate his 63rd birthday. But the real surprise awaited his children after the party. When the guests had dispersed and they were alone, George asked Michael, Sarah, and James to stay late. He took a deep breath and began his story. George told them everything, about his fears and suspicions, about the ridiculous cross-dressing plan, about how he had overheard them talking about the party. He hid nothing, honestly admitting his mistakes and the stupidity of his actions. The children's reaction was unexpected. Instead of the anger or disappointment George had so feared, they reacted with understanding and sympathy. Sarah even cried, hugging her father and saying that they must have noticed how hard it had been for him all those years since her mother's death. This conversation was the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. George opened up to his children about his loneliness, his fear of losing touch with them. In turn, the children shared their worries, fears, and hopes. From that day forward, they began working to rebuild their relationship. George began to spend more time with his children and grandchildren. He had regular lunches with Michael, discussing not only the business of the company, but also his life and his relationship with his wife and children. He became a frequent visitor to Sarah's gallery, genuinely interested in her work and creative plans. With James, they began a tradition of Saturday walks, during which they talked about everything from politics to philosophy. But most importantly, George learned to be open and honest with his children. If he was worried or concerned about something, he spoke up, not letting his fears and suspicions grow to absurd proportions. Tonight's Sunday dinner was a vivid testament to the changes that had taken place in their family over these 3 months. Previously, such meetings had been rare and held in a tense atmosphere. Now they had become a weekly tradition that everyone in the family looked forward to. "Grandpa? Grandpa!" Emma's ringing voice snapped George out of his musings. "Tell us a story." George smiled, looking at his granddaughter. "Of course, my dear. What kind of tale do you want to hear?" "Tell us about the wizard who pretended to be an ordinary man," Ethan shouted, running up to the table. George felt his heart skip a beat. He cast a quick glance at his children, but They didn't seem to notice anything unusual about Ethan's request. "Okay," George said, gathering his thoughts. "I'll tell you a story about a wizard who forgot how important it is to trust those you love." As George told a child-adapted version of his story, turning himself into a wizard and his children into good fairies, he noticed Michael, Sarah, and James exchanging understanding looks. They had never spoken about it directly, but George suspected that they had guessed his cross-dressing prank. However, instead of getting angry or judging him, they seemed to accept it as further proof of how much he loved them, albeit expressing that love in sometimes strange ways. Finishing the tale, George looked at his watch. "Okay, youngsters, it's time for bed. Everyone has a big day tomorrow."